for the argument essay, as I said earlier in other posts, that I wanted to take things a little bit further. I want to see more sophistication from your logic, just raising the bar as you would expect as we progress into further and further essays. So for that, you're going to start outlining your logic in a little bit greater detail than we have before. So to illustrate this, let's consider a thesis and one reason. This would be the basis for one body paragraph. Okay. So first we start with that thesis, right? Let's say I wanted to argue that cloning is unethical. Okay, right? Arguable, people could disagree with it, sure. And then I have my reason one, and remember it needs to follow the because test. So if I think to myself the word because, I'll put it in parentheses here. Can I say cloning is unethical because cloning is unnatural? Grammatically, that makes sense. We'll talk about whether or not the logic does in a moment, but in terms of the structure, that works perfectly. Okay, so we want to start there with each of our paragraphs, right? We don't want to think about the whole essay all at once. We want to really break it down into individual reasons. Okay, so if this is my reason, clearly this is not enough for the paragraph. That's one sentence, right? Just my topic sentence. So I have to think about how can I convince my reader of two things. Okay, first, in this case, I have to prove that the reason is true. Okay, so I'll need to prove that cloning is unnatural. Okay, so let me ask you: is cloning unnatural? If you said yes, you would be incorrect, at least partially incorrect, because cloning is just the copying of cells. Okay, millions of times a day, you're having that going on with your body, right? Your various cells are dividing, cloning themselves, right? But to be fair, that's not what you were probably thinking about when I said cloning, right? So I'd probably want to reallocate my words here, perhaps say something like human cloning is unethical because human cloning is unnatural, okay? So is human cloning, the idea of taking a single human and then turning them into an exact copy of themselves, unnatural insofar as it does not happen in nature by itself without human intervention? Yes, that would not be very difficult to prove, okay? But there's something else that I have to prove. That's not enough. If I just write a paragraph explaining how human cloning is unnatural, that does not prove my thesis. I also have to prove that the reason supports the thesis. Okay? In other words, I have to not only prove that human cloning is unnatural, I have to prove that it being unnatural makes it unethical. Okay? So I'm kind of working under the assumption that unnatural equals unethical. Is that true? Well, sometimes it is. There's some things that people do that we would consider unethical or not morally correct because it's going against nature, but there's plenty of things that we do and use. For instance, if you're wearing polyester, well, that's not natural. If you take medication that's derived from plants or other chemicals that are not naturally occurring, well, that's unnatural, but most of us don't think of all those things as unethical. Okay, there's plenty of unethical things or plenty of unnatural things that we think are perfectly acceptable, right? So with this paragraph, we'd really have to rework this because once we see this, well, being unnatural isn't enough, right? So we'd have to rework it, and this is what the logic is going to show us, okay? So like I said, you need to prove that the reason is true, but also that the reason supports the thesis, okay? And if you think about this in terms of deductive reasoning, it'll look something like this, right? Our logical conclusion is what our thesis is. That's what we're working towards, right? So it kind of looks the reverse of what it does on the page, right? Because the thesis is earlier, but that's really our logical conclusion. That's what everything is working towards. So we start with our premise. That's the equivalent of, all men are mortal, right? If you remember that example. That's essentially our reason, our individual reason in the paragraph. Then Socrates is a man, right? That's the evidence about the premise or the principle. So in our paragraph, that's going to be proof of the reason and the reason leading to the thesis. Okay, that's where we actually prove that the reason's true and that it does lead to the thesis. And then if that's all true, then it leads to the logical conclusion, the thesis statement. Okay, so that's really what we're looking for there. So how is this going to play out in your writing exploration E? Okay, well, let's look at the assignment sheet. And this is also available on D2L. In this writing exploration, you're going to outline. Okay, so you're not writing the essay yet, but you're outlining your deductive reasoning with the reasons you have so far. So this is pretty straightforward. First, you're going to write your current thesis. the thesis at this moment in time. It may change, it may not, just whatever you're working with right now at the top of the paper. And this is for the argument essay, not the antithesis, the argument, so the one that you truly believe. Make sure it's arguable, appropriately qualified, strongly worded, all that good stuff that we've talked about before. Then, write down one reason that the thesis is true. Write it as a complete topic sentence for a paragraph as it would appear in the essay. And then in a bulleted list, not a full paragraph, okay, because we're outlining, list the things that you will prove in order for that reason to be logically sound. Okay, so pay attention to your deductive reasoning. Okay, after you've done this with one reason, repeat it with as many reasons as you can. Have a minimum of 2 for the writing exploration, but if you have more for me to comment on, that's great, because then you're going to get more feedback. And your document should look exactly like the samples here. Okay, so let's say this is my thesis. This relates to the other video. The government should increase taxes on unhealthy foods. So my first reason is that increased taxes will cut down on unhealthy food consumption, lessening obesity. Okay, that's my reason that I'm giving to support the thesis. So what do I need to prove? Now notice, I'm not proving them yet. I'm just listing for myself what I need to prove. So first I have to prove that higher taxes will change behavior, right? Because I'm saying increased taxes will cut down on unhealthy food consumption. So I need to prove that that's true, which, as we know, that's very questionable. So I would have to prove that with good evidence. Two, I would also have to prove unhealthy foods contribute to obesity, which is not difficult to do, okay? Because otherwise, cutting down on the unhealthy food consumption wouldn't lead to obesity lessening, right? Unless there's a connection. But then here's one of those underlying assumptions that I need to address. I have to prove that the government has a role in making us healthier, okay? Because I'm saying the government should increase taxes on unhealthy foods. Just because increased taxes will have this effect, and let's just say that I've proven that it has, which maybe I have, maybe I haven't. But even if they do have that effect, there are people who argue that that's not the government's place, right? That's intruding on our personal freedoms. So you would have to make the case that not only is this an effective solution, but it's warranted, it's justified by the government, okay? You really have to cover all those things in your paragraph with your evidence, detailed in a full paragraph, not a bulleted list. But right now we're just outlining it so we know what we're looking for. We can find evidence to fit each of these 3 points. Second reason, tax revenue can be used to pay for healthcare costs related to obesity. So that's another reason saying that, we should increase these taxes, because then it can be used to help the problems that the unhealthy foods are creating in the first place. So first I have to prove that healthcare costs in the country are higher because of obesity. Because if they're not, this is a red herring, because the costs aren't related. So I'd have to prove that, which isn't difficult to do. I need to prove that the called for taxes will actually be able to help pay for the healthcare costs. If the tax revenue is so small, then it doesn't really matter. But so I need to prove that there's some substantial nature to them. And then finally, once again, I need to prove the government should be involved with the healthcare costs. There are people who disagree with that. So I need to prove that, once again, not only is it effective, but that it then is justifying the government getting involved. That's the whole proving the reason and proving that the reason leads to the thesis. Okay, so at the very least, you should have this much in your writing exploration. If you have more, that would be wonderful, but start with at least this, okay? Because I'll give you some feedback. We'll really make sure that your logic is on the right track so that our final essay of the semester, this argument essay, can really be as logically sound as we can possibly make it.